All right. Well, welcome back to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source. You can find us online at epspodcast.club. On Facebook, there's an EPS podcast page, a group, and just recently, EPS podcast can be found on Patreon. And I'm joined today by Audie, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about a movie that I think of all the different Disney movies, this one tends to stand out for a lot of people, myself included. And but it's funny is it doesn't really have much representation at the parks, and that would be the movie Robin Hood. So this came out in 1973, and today we're going to be using the animated Robin Hood from 1973 as a primary source of the time period from which it came. So you're a fan of Robin Hood to the maximum degree. I've seen that you actually don't you own a cell from this movie?
I don't have a cell. I have the film, a film strip of it.
Oh, okay.
I have lots and lots of memorabilia from this movie. I have I'm just looking around. Part of my collection is out right now. I have a lunchbox, I have figurines, music box, signed pictures, a commemorative coin, stuffed animals, lots of books. I have the board game. I have two of the posters.
Now I'd be curious, and you don't have to look at all these right now, but I'd be curious if a lot of, I would assume most of those things came out in conjunction with the movie, that they weren't.
Yeah, a lot of them did.
Or at least, or maybe the VHS release some years later, but.
Yeah, a lot of them are pretty old, or pretty old, right? 1973. Oh my God.
That's almost 50 years now.
I know.
It's crazy. I always think of the 70s as being pretty recent, now it's antique, if you look at it's no longer just vintage.
They're producing memorabilia for this movie still. But like you said, I feel like it doesn't have as much representation in the Disneyverse as some of the other films.
You have to look for it a little bit more. Apparently, so the maker of Zootopia said that he was very inspired. It's one of his favorite movies, and so when he made Zootopia, the fox character in that wearing green, was modeled a bit after Robin Hood the fox.
I didn't know that. I love Zootopia.
It's a fun one. It came out right around the same time as Sing, another animal centric animated CGI animated feature, and they share some traits as having like animals living in this society, and it kind of matching their different traits, and kind of no real explanation of when they got that power, which actually kind of brings me back to Robin Hood 1973. It was, I forget the viewing number, but it was some years ago. I was watching it with my wife, and we just kind of said, it's kind of like, it's almost as if the animals were putting on their own performance of Robin Hood. That and they kind of hinted that at the beginning too, when Alan and Dale says, here in the animal world, we have our own telling of the story. And so it's almost like and then the way the opening credits of it show all the characters and tell you the kind of animal that they've matched up with it. So it's kind of a funny thing. And another thing to consider before we launch into the questions and the answers is that we're familiar in the recent decades, really since the late 80s, early 90s, of Disney animated features coming out at least once a year, if not more. And that you really can't go to the theater at any given time without a Disney movie being in there. But as far as the animated features go, this Robin Hood 1973 was actually the first one in a couple of years. It was preceded by Aristocats, and before that, The Jungle Book
Mhm.
and they actually recycle some of the animation from those two movies into Robin Hood,
Yeah, there's a
which
shot there from Cinderella as well.
yeah,
And
Cinderella, and I think Snow White might even be there too. I know that the
there's
part where
so
they're
many.
singing the phony King of England, but that also
Right.
adds more. I know it was probably a cutting measure for Disney, because they had just opened up Disney World 2 years before, and apparently without remembering to put a they did eventually put a Robin Hood thing in there, but and Walt Disney had passed away a few years before, so I think the uh, the the company was still reorganizing itself a bit, and perhaps not putting nearly as much interest and attention into the movies
Mhm.
itself, and they're just like, well, you know let's go with this old English folk story that we don't really have to pay any royalties for because nobody owns Robin Hood. It's not like some of their other stories that they purchased the rights to, and we have this new park and our leader's gone, so yeah, let's just cheap out and do this Disney. But it adds more credibility to the idea of the animals, or maybe even not the animals, just like the actual animated animals themselves, as if kind of like a Wreck-It Ralph type situation, like after the makers of the movie go to bed, all of the animated characters come to life and start making their own movies, and they're like, oh, let's do Robin Hood. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That is going to
Because
be canon in my head from now on.
yes, from now
If this
on. Well,
happens.
I mean, because Little John looks so much like Baloo.
He's the same.
He's basically him. And
And it's also
uh
hilarious. So it's the same voice.
so let's start with the first question. And we can combine these together because it says, what material is it made from and how was this made? And so the movie, it was made from, like I said, an old English folklore story from late medieval period about this. Sometimes he's a nobleman, sometimes he's just an ordinary person that usually steals from the rich and gives to the poor. And so there's ballads, there's books, there's all sorts of retelling. Back in the early part of the Hollywood age, Errol Flynn was famous for
Mm-hmm.
making, and even before him, Douglas Fairbanks had done a silent movie of Robin Hood.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's almost established, definitely in the Hollywood age, as being this swashbuckling hero swinging around from, on curtains. And I don't know if there's any mention of that. I've never really read the books or any of the ballads of it. I think I had a troubadour come by my house with a lute one time singing about Robin Hood, and I was busy playing video
That guy was
games and I didn't
awesome.
really pay attention. But um and then like I said, the how is it made component, it was made from all those new footage, but also recycled stuff, and like I said about the Disney animal component. But what does all of this tell you about 1970s society, culture, politics, economics? Why do you think, of all the stories that Disney could go with, they decided to do Robin Hood in that time period?
Man, I mean, we could talk about the early 70s all day we could talk about it for the next decade, right? So we're getting out of Vietnam, and there's, I can see the appeal of a story like Robin Hood in that sort of situation. But as far as whether what Disney was trying to do with this story, whether it was just somebody's baby, or as you said, because it was a folk tale that had no rights and
Yeah.
had always consistently been a popular story as well. I love this age of Disney. I love 101 Dalmatians and Jungle Book and Aristocats and Winnie the Pooh and sort of movies from this, maybe sort of the second era, right? Like you
Yeah.
have the classic Disney that are these just masterpieces, and then you have the second era, which they're a little bit more cost cutty, but still I think masterpieces in their own right. So I'm not sure that there's a definitive answer that I can give you for
Well,
one reason.
I like what you're saying, though. I think it really, I did a little bit of research on this. I try really hard not to, like I was saying before, do too much, because the movie in this case should stand alone as a primary source, and we should be able to read into it and extract ideas about the era and to match it up. But you're right. 1973, 72, I'm assuming they worked on it for more than just a couple of weeks.
Right.
Who knows? All that borrowed animation, they may have just slapped it together in a week. But they, they have so much of the vibe. I mean, the 70s, the early 70s, just like any other time period, are a holdover of the late 60s. It's not anything.
Right.
It's not like a light switch goes on as soon as a decade dawns and all right, new star, everything. It was really reeling from the way that the 60s came to a pretty dismal end. The 60s started with so much hope and promise, and with a new young president, and then was haunted by his death, and then his brother's assassination, and today that we're recording it is Martin Luther King Jr. And he had been killed a few years before to close out that very tumultuous decade. And so that trickles down. I don't think it was always on everybody's mind all the time. Another thing to consider is that television had really taken over, as well as other forms of pop culture. The younger generation had been growing up on rock and roll. I mentioned this in another podcast where they weren't just listening to innocent, 2-minute long ditties about, to dance to at the soda fountain or, the cafe. They were going to Woodstock. They were going to hard rock concerts, and, things were getting, and so there was some competition. And this is a kids movie. It's meant for children and families. Television offered a pretty big competition by 1973 than had in a previous time period. And
Sure.
I think another reason, and Disney had its own TV programs as well, but another reason why they perhaps just said, all right, let's go with a tried and true one, and let's talk about, let's bring Robin Hood to the forefront. So
Sure.
we know who made it. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, just in talking about television, I mean, Disney's Robin Hood is essentially a Western, and Westerns were still very popular. I mean, the golden age of Westerns was really like the 50s, right? But you had like the spaghetti Westerns, and you had TV shows. I don't know how late Bonanza, I mean, but like the Gunsmoke and all of these television shows like you were talking about.
Yeah.
And not that Robin Hood is an inherently Western story, because it's not. It's, medieval England or whatever.
No, but, yeah.
Supposed to be place. But this version certainly is, right down to the cast, right down to the stagecoach, right down to the accents and the songs. And so
I was going to say, I'm glad you brought that up.
Oh,
it because the next question is who likely made it. We could just slap on it again. Disney made it, but you mentioned about it being a Western, and it's made in the United States. I'm assuming they didn't go on location to sketch out, exactly what Nottingham, England looked like and everything. I'm assuming that they just drew it all in, what was it, Burbank or Anaheim? But so many of the voices are American accents and American actors, including the narrator.
And not just American actors, but Pat Buttram and Roger Miller,
right,
and Andy Devine, and George Lindsay, and these people who are just these cowboy Southern Western, sounds.
The opening song is called Whistle Stop.
Yeah.
It's about it. I when I think of a whistle stop, I think of a Western train station, or some kind of little quick little get on, and there's locomotives in the movie. There's in the part where the great chase scene, and
the archery contest, and they turn into a train.
One of my all-time favorite scenes in all of movies is that
it's great
whole sequence, especially when the alligator man gets run over.
Oh my God. Yeah. You've been waiting for that guy to get it. Like the whole
he's like, it just flattens out.
And then when they squeeze the elephant's trunk as he's trying to like do the trumpet, and it goes back out his ears. I mean, that was just classic.
So do you think that there's anything more to the aspect I mean, it's made in the United States. There are English actors in it. The
There
main
are.
protagonists are played by
Absolutely.
English actors. One thing that's also should be pointed out, there's no merry men in this version of Robin Hood.
Well,
There's Little
there
John.
are
There's
three.
yeah, there's Little John, Friar Tuck. Friar Tuck doesn't really hang out with Robin Hood as much. He's not like living in Sherwood Forest with Robin Hood. He just kind of comes and goes every so often. There's a lot more children involved with
Yeah.
obvious reasons. They were trying to appeal to their main audience of like, wouldn't it be cool if you were friends with Robin Hood? But it's funny because the main characters, Robin Hood is played by Brian Bedford, who's
Mhm.
English. Peter Ustinov plays Prince John, English. And then Monica Evans, Maid Marian, English. And I think Cluck also is played by English woman.
Carol
But
Shelley.
so many of the other characters are all American, and they're not trying to
Oh,
put on
Terry
an English
Thomas.
accent.
Sir
Oh yeah,
Hiss.
Terry Thomas. Yep. So Sir Hiss, who's
Yeah.
has the best lines in that whole movie.
Totally.
Log one. Do you think there's anything to that as far as it being made by Disney, and that they're not trying to? They could have very easily had an all English
Sure.
cast, but not only did they go, no, we're going to have plenty of Americans in it, but Americans with such distinct
Mm.
accents. The Sheriff of Nottingham doesn't
It's
sound like he's from Nottingham.
no. And he
He's
doesn't he has that walk. I was talking with my
yeah,
dad earlier about how he kind of walks. He's got the belt, he kind of walks like it like one of those old-timey western,
yeah.
sheriffs kind of throwing his gut around. And I think it's such a strange choice that so magically works. It's like we have the legit British element in there that really says, nope, this is Robin Hood. This is real. We have Peter Ustinov, who's a
Mhm.
treasure. Um, you know, but then they've just the rest of it is this other thing. And it so easily could have not worked at all. But I think it works really, really well. And I don't think it necessarily would have worked with a John Wayne Robin Hood. I think it had to be somebody like Brian Bedford.
So they
I
really
don't
had to ground themselves, at least put
Yeah.
one foot into England, and then kind of cross the Atlantic and bring the American audience, who is the main audience,
Hmm.
to be there. I mean, I love the Roger Miller singing. He has, not on this soundtrack, but he has a great number of hit songs as a country western singer.
Sure. Yeah.
He has that great song about uh, going to England. So he must have some kind of affinity for England. What is it? I forget the name of the song right now, but it's featured in England Swings. That's the one. They feature it in the movie or the movie, the TV show Friends. When they go to England, they play
Oh.
this song as Joey and Chandler are touring around. But it's almost like the British invasion had taken place in music a couple years before, and really solidified the Anglo-American relationship that had forged during the Second World War.
Sure.
And I think that, as silly as it may seem, that Robin Hood, is right up there with NATO as far as good relations between the countries. It may have had something to do with that the special relationship between the two countries is, we're sharing in their folklore. We're taking their stories and putting our own spin on it,
Hmm.
but not just calling it something totally different,
Sure.
and keeping it alive.
And again, the fact that this is such a well-known story here as well, I think allowed them a little bit more liberty with being a little bonkers with how they interpreted it. If nobody had ever heard of Robin Hood or this figure, and this was a brand new story, and they're like, wait, why are some people have English accents and some people sound like they're from, Texas or whatever, it might not have worked as well. But they had that really solid foundation.
It shares in a lot of foundational American values. The idea of somebody going up against the tax man and helping the little guy, going up to the king and knocking over their crown. And, and especially as the country was approaching the bicentennial in 1976, even if it was just kind of subliminal, I think there was definitely messages of, bringing back stories that highlighted such a thing. So yeah, I think there's a reason why Robin Hood, of all the, because there's plenty of other medieval folklore stories that could have easily been put into the movies, and including Reynard. I'm not saying it correctly or not. Reynard the Fox, who is a old 12th century fox knight type character. And apparently the artist who eventually drew Robin Hood for Disney had been working on a Reynard the Fox story back in the early 60s, but they weren't really sure if that would catch on very well, that people would be familiar enough with it. But Robin Hood, it's a simple story in all of its tellings. It easily matches up with American values of, like, oh, I don't want to have to pay these taxes. This is, especially this one, because in so many of the other versions of it, it's, he's stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. It's not just the Sheriff of Nottingham. It's not just Prince John that he's going up against. It's just rich people in general. You see some noblemen going through the Stewart Forest, and here come the merry men to. But in this one, it's just Prince John and his minions that they are concerned with. There's no other, he's basically the only baddie in the whole thing. And that's just like, hey, Americans, you don't like monarchies, or taxes. Here you go. Here's your bad guy. And, look at how, weak and undeserving of any kind of power this guy is.
And yet when Richard comes back at the end, this beautiful, strong, he's got this flowing mane.
He's early Mufasa.
Yeah. And also Peter Ustinov with this even posher sort of accent. So it's, there's that as well, that we got rid of, like you're talking about him being weak, and that's the whole angle of Prince John in this, is how weak he is. He has nightmares. That's my favorite scene, is when he's having the nightmares in his bed with his butt sticking up in the air.
Yeah, he sucks his thumb. And I suppose we may as well touch on that now, since there is a question of what ideas or behavior does this convey.
Oh,
I don't think this. No, I mean, it's perfectly fine that we leap ahead, because I think it's brought up. So think about, for Americans in 1973. Going on nationally and internationally. You mentioned before the Vietnam War, that President Nixon had in 1968 run on the campaign of a number of things, including, listening to the silent majority, that Americans were tired of all the chaos in the streets. And he promised to bring the end to the Vietnam War. Peace with honor was his guarantee. But by 1973, 5 years later, it's still going on. And he had, Watergate hadn't happened yet. I mean, the actual break-in did, but all the investigations and everything, and his eventual resignation was not for another year after this movie came out. But there was plenty of people who were looking, taking jabs at Nixon and calling him weak and paranoid. I mean, he was pretty well known for having, worries about this, that, or the other, enemies lists and things like that. And he had been the vice president to a much more popular, strong president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who he himself had passed away recently as of 1973. And I wonder if there's, maybe it's kind of not really on the minds of the makers of Robin Hood, but they were thinking about it. It was definitely part of the, and that's why this is a great primary source, is, this is kind of the way that we see our leaders, that this is, because Robin Hood's the renegade. He's the um the bad boy. He's who's the guy who wrote Steal This Book, Gabby Hoffman, of kind of the anarchist, counterculture guy who shows up and is causing trouble, kind of thorn in the side of the establishment. And I can't help but think that there's something going on there, and according to this version of Robin Hood, Sir Hiss is the reason why King Richard went off on that crazy crusade.
He hypnotized him, and I'm sure it wasn't just because they had that cool hypnosis animation from Jungle Book. I'm sure there was some other reason that he hypnotized him. But.
Yeah, he's another carryover character, isn't he?
I love him so much, though. Oh my gosh.
He is the best, and because Terry Thomas didn't do his voice, didn't do the snake in the Jungle Book's voice, right? It was
no, that was Winnie the
that was the same guy as Winnie the Pooh. Yeah,
Sterling Holloway. Yeah.
But I really liked that, they explain, the Third Crusade was like, that was the big one. That was like the King's Crusade. That was, and they just explain it away in this cartoon that a snake looked into the guy, just like, because in their version, whatever, like there's really no world outside of the drawings here. So yeah, go ahead. That's why he's not here right now, is because this guy,
yeah, and there's this whole specter of the mother through this whole movie. Mother who liked Richard better. Mother who presumably is dead, who, Prince John just cannot survive without. It's what an interesting and strange backstory for this character.
And but it works. I am such a sucker for the like bad guy, like the bumbling idiot bad guy duo. I love like Mr. Burns and Smithers and Dr. Evil and his crew, and in this case Prince John and Sir Hiss. They're just and it's just so funny. I love when, because deep down they're awful people, or in this case Lion and Snake, they're backstabbers. But when you see their little interactions in their inner sanctum, and there was stuff like that, counterculture type stuff about Nixon. They had made a movie, I think, while he was still in office, or at least, or some kind of TV show where they basically did just that, where they showed him in the Oval Office with these, having these stupid conversations with his underlings, and see him like driving around in a the presidential limousine and like kicking the his vice president out the door to go deal with something, and it's very, so it's along the same lines as like by 1973 easily this is how we see our, at least some of the culture sees our leaders as. Absolutely.
And I mean, mocking those in power has always been popular. It's always been fun.
Yeah, but especially I think in this era, it sure. No holding back. If Disney's doing it, it's clear that it's become mainstream. It's no longer just the counterculture dealing with it.
And as you were talking about earlier too, I mean, there's a sort of darkness behind that sort of attitude at this time as well, because people were, there was a revolution happening, and everyone knew someone who was affected by Vietnam, and so it was lighthearted, but I think you do see a resurgence of that type of humor when people are sort of distressed at their cores.
Yeah, and I don't think that I don't know if you heard my podcast I did about the Snoopy Christmas song,
I missed
but
it.
it was,
I need to listen to the
by
podcast about the Christmas song.
the Royal Guardsmen, that song was written by a serious songwriter who in similar time period, so late 60s, who was really wanting to, it's classified as an anti-war song, the Christmas, the Snoopy's Christmas, because it's all about a truce, and the songwriter had written many songs. I forget the name right now, but had written a litany of hit songs, including some pacifist anthems and things like that. And so, and that was about as mainstream as you can get, as far as having a song on the radio at Christmas time about Snoopy, and the Red Baron going at it. And here we have Robin Hood. So by the time either there's people within the structures of these companies that are able to just kind of slip stuff in there and get by the censors, or it's just become, it's open season on this, that's the way that the entire culture had shifted. So my question next is, I guess we could combine this one, is what was the maker's role or status in society, and why did they make this movie? And I think that they have a lot going on hand in hand. Like I said before, Disney was, I don't want to say it was in a state of chaos by 1973, but they definitely were reorganizing. The leader, the founding member, the founder of their company, Walt Disney, he gave them the name, had passed away. And he had, I don't know if there's much to it as far as he died because of his stress over opening a second park, but that had something in 1971. Disney World had opened up in Florida, and that was a big project. That was something that was years in the making, trying to find the right place in the United States. And that in itself matched up with, by that time period, more American families had money to spend on things like vacations, but they weren't necessarily willing to fly across the country or drive across the country to California, that they were hoping to go somewhere, give them an East Coast option in Florida. But I can't help but think that the fact that the company was in at least some state of disarray is why they made this particular movie, that they were still the kings of children entertainment, family entertainment. They've been making these movies for 40 years now. By 1973, it's become the expectation, but they might not have had all of the efforts that they had put in before, balancing a TV presentations, balancing a new theme park, and trying to branch out into other kinds of fields of pop culture. Do you think there's anything to that way of thinking, or do you think I'm barking up the wrong tree?
I mean, that certainly makes sense to me. I can't pretend to know anything really about the history of Disney as a company, but sure, I mean, that makes sense.
So I mean,
definitely see the shift, as we were talking about earlier. You can definitely see the shift in animation between those early classic films and sort of the newer 60s and 70s Disney movies. Although, and I'm just confirming this now, I believe it was this was the same director as Sleeping Beauty.
Wolfgang
Reitherman. I'm just looking at his, I mean, he did everything. He was an animator on all of the old stuff. And it says on Wikipedia that he was a sequence director on Sleeping Beauty, but I feel like if you watch the movie itself, it calls him the director, so maybe that's what a sequence director. I don't know.
Yeah,
I feel like if you watch Sleeping Beauty, his name is the director, but I could be wrong.
And animation is much different than directing pretty much anything. And I always wonder that whenever I watch an animated show or movie and this is directed by, I just picture somebody walking around where all the artists are drawing and just like, draw that better, go faster, like his hand should be over here, not over there. but I think
Oh, okay.
sequencing
It's just,
everything together
yeah.
would be, the equivalent of, he's the director in charge of putting that all together. Yeah, I have one of my actually one of my
There are
favorite
3
books.
sequence directors. Okay, sorry. There's a supervising director and 3 sequence directors. Okay, sorry.
But they wouldn't slap,
No.
most of us don't even know animated directors. It's not the same as the Steven Spielberg or anything like that.
No,
But
and it should be. It
one
should
of
be.
one of my favorite autobiographies is that of Bill Peet. And Bill Peet, he wrote a bunch of children's books after he worked for Disney for a long time, and he was integral as I think he directed the Jungle Book or he was up there. But in his autobiography, which covers his entire life, he shows how he was on the ground floor of the Disney company, that he was hired early in the 30s to work for Disney when they were really branching out. And according to his telling of it, it did seem that Walt Disney himself, if not just the top brass at the company, always looked within the company to find talent. So it's not outlandish to think that Wolfgang Reitherman was working as early as on Sleeping Beauty, and just kind of was cultivated by the company of, you have talent, you have, you can draw, because that's what Bill Peet reported, is that his first job was to draw all of the Disney characters over and over and over again. And he actually walked out of the job because he was so tired of drawing Donald Duck or Goofy over and over again. He's like, enough. And he left. And then when he came back the next day to get his stuff from it was like basically a factory type room where all the artists, all the people that just did the animations were housed. When he came back, there was a note saying, go to the other building because they want to see you upstairs. And that's where his career as one of the producers started off. But Walt Disney himself he was a perfectionist. He had an eye for detail. He would not be happy, even the slightest, there's storyboards that cover the entire wall, and the slightest thing that he didn't like, he'd be up all night changing things around or making his artists go by. So without him involved in this, he died 4 years before this. I think that also might be a reason why we don't get the best that Disney has to offer, as far as, let's cut some corners here, let's recycle some animation. But I think that,
sorry, go on.
But my last point is that what that tells me also is, like I was saying before, it tells us something about the audiences. The audience at the time had so many other things to deal with. Back when Snow White came out, and then Sleeping Beauty and all those, and Cinderella, that was it. That was your children's entertainment. That was your movie that you would make a point to go. By the time we get to this, if the kid misses Disney's Robin Hood, so what? They have TV to turn on. They can, go see some other movie, or go play with their friends. And, it's not quite the same impact as if, they had cut corners earlier on. But it does say something about the audience. What were you going to say?
Oh, I think it's interesting that if you look at this film objectively, as we are sort of kind of trying to do, there are issues with it. I mean, there's a scene where Skippy, the little rabbit boy, is sort of turning a bow around in his arms, and the string passes through his arm. I remember at one point there's inconsistencies with a lot of, like, with Prince John's jewels in his crown and rings, and where they are and where they go. But there's also this real magic about it. And you mentioned at the beginning, and I have found this too, just anecdotally, a lot of people I know, when I say, what's your favorite Disney movie, they'll say Robin Hood. Despite the fact that it hasn't benefited from this major, this Disney powerhouse, like advertising and merchandising and memorabilia. It has to some extent, obviously, because it's a Disney movie, but it doesn't seem to be one of their favored, golden movies. And I think what you're describing about the company at that time, and when you're looking at these people that worked on Robin Hood, and they worked on Cinderella, and they worked on Sleeping Beauty, which is that's a whole other podcast, but which is a masterpiece, right? and they're getting these actors that are so wonderful. So it's almost like, despite the hardships that they had to, or despite the corners they had to cut, there's still that sort of magic that seeps through in this movie and in others from this era.
Some of the critics of the movie when it first came out, by and large, it got good reviews, but some of the people said it looked too television. It didn't really look like a movie. It didn't have, and I can kind of see that, but in my opinion, that's what I like about it. I think sometimes Disney, in particular Disney, they have almost too much grandeur, sometimes undeserved grandeur for some of their pictures. And this one is so simple and so nice and cozy. It's so charming. It just has such a nice.
It is. It's charming. And, you think about something like Bambi, which is one of my favorites also, which is just lush and gorgeous from the first frame to the last frame. And then you think about Robin Hood, and it is a little, television-y, but maybe its charm is not the animation. Maybe it's the character's expressions. And that is the animation, but maybe it's not the lushness of the animation, but the character of the animation and the character of the voices and the script and the songs.
I think it's and it has a decent soundtrack. It's not quite the musical that Disney was known for or became known for eventually. It has just
a funny little musical.
Yeah. And
the random songs and like pieces of songs. And
yeah. If memory serves, there's only one part where it's just Little John that sings, right? As far as like the Phony King of England song, and
right.
Alan Adale
sings
every now and then he's in the story too. I like that part where he's in jail for not paying his taxes, and
right,
you're not really sure like where he is on the story in that one. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on Alan Adale, which I plan to do, and I don't mean just one episode. I mean, I could probably go on 30 episodes, why this rooster is, talks the way he does. And it's like, wait, is he narrating? Is he in the story? He just got arrested and then he's like, yeah. And he turns to the camera and starts, he's like, things are looking pretty tough for us. And, it's like, wait a minute, which one are you? That doesn't.
The love song is sung. I don't know if it's supposed to be being sung by Maid Marian or if it's just some other woman singing a song.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's from her point of view.
Yeah,
it's her thoughts about Robin Hood.
True.
But she's not actually singing it during that part, so it's just kind of like her inner monologue, I suppose, with that song. And I think that one was actually nominated for an Oscar for best song.
Is it really? It's pretty.
Yeah, it's a nice one. So I think we've covered the next one pretty well, but so where was it made? I assume California. And then what are the locations that are associated with the source? And that would be England. They, the whole, Nottingham, it's a real place. I don't know if they ever call it Sherwood Forest. You see it on a map in the movie. Sherwood Forest is marked out there.
They do when she's playing with the kids too. So this is Sherwood Forest.
Yeah, there it is. Yep. And even then you get the idea that Maid Marian's not a local, that she's been brought there fairly recently. And that's otherwise, because Robin says how it's been so long since he's seen her, and he's still there, I assume.
Yeah, she's been living in London for a number of years.
That's right. Okay, so she's unfamiliar with Sherwood Forest and all that. They mentioned Devonshire at one point. That's where his and I always thought his costume was pretty good. I would be fooled by it.
I would have been fooled, definitely.
The way the bill, if the bill didn't move as he talked, then that would give it away. But the fact that it does, even though I assume all it would take is somebody looking like there's a fox mouth inside of your giant bill, whatever kind of bird you are, stork, or right.
And when he finally gets discovered by Sir Hiss, he kind of looks up like at his butt. Have you noticed that? Like he kind
Yeah.
of looks like, did he see his tail? I'm assuming he sees his tail in there.
Yeah,
Like
that must be
his
the giveaway.
tail.
And
Let's assume that. He doesn't just recognize his butt. Like
he's like, that stork, that doesn't look proper anatomy for a stork. And Hiss is an expert on those things, apparently. I mean, he's always slithering on the ground, so I guess he has pretty familiar with looking up at other animals and being able to tell.
But nobody like the disguises fool everybody in that movie. Everybody's disguise fools everybody else in that movie. That's one of the things.
And that's what's one of the charms of it. And they really just bounce from one trope to another in this. They just go from one thing, and it's because there's disguises in the other tellings of Robin Hood. That's a pretty common, the tournament. They always have that scene in most Robin Hood tellings, one version or another. But the whole idea of how over the top. I mean, Little John shows up in some weird pink, and just like goes right up to Prince John and is like, "Hey, PJ!" Like slaps him on the back and, "Oh, PJ, I like that. Put it on my luggage."
Prince John is like into it. He's like, "Yeah, I love this guy.
It's about time. Let my buddy go.
Release my buddy.
Release my buddy." This is great. So I think the fact that they don't really, apparently there was some some discussion behind, as the movie was being made, if they were going to actually set it in traditional English location, or if they were going to try to find a new location for it. I always get a bit wary when they take well-known stories with very definitive locations and decide to change them.
Yeah.
And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but usually it's like, why don't you just but I think most Americans probably wouldn't be able to, on a map of England, point out Nottingham, just as it's, oh, yep, up there, without some kind of context. Yet we don't necessarily, where is it in regards to London? Where is it in regards to York or any of the other English cities and stuff? But we don't need it to be that way. By this point, Robin Hood in Nottingham and Sherwood Forest is the same as Peter Pan in Neverland. It's the same as any of the other characters and their locations. I think a lot of people actually might even be surprised it's a real place. It's not just made up because it sounds fun. And so I think it goes along with the idea that people were pretty familiar with this character of Robin Hood, and didn't really need to have it retold to them. There's not a full explanation of who he is. They just launch right into the story. I mean, I love the way it opens up like a book. You see the pages turn, and they walk into it like that. Something that I think was borrowed directly by Shrek. When I was just watching Shrek the other day, and they do the same thing. They start out with him reading the story of Princess Fiona, and he's, oh, what a bunch of, and it just like, I mean, that whole movie just takes classic stories, and Robin Hood's in that one too. He's French for some reason, but he shows up and does an Irish dance with his merry men. That's much more the Errol Flynn Robin Hood. But and it's funny because Shrek is all about fairy tales and fairy tale characters. Robin Hood's not a fairy tale character. He's even if he's folklore. He may have been a real person, but even if he wasn't, he's not. He doesn't have special powers. He can't fly, or he can't do anything magical. So it's just kind of funny how we've just kind of, as Americans in particular, have taken Robin Hood and just kind of thrown him in with and I think the reason why Shrek did it, because much of that movie was directly as a way to poke fun at Disney, because the founder of DreamWorks had been used to be over at Disney, and it was a way of that's why so many of the Disney princesses are in Shrek, was kind of guys And I
Right.
think they just kind of threw a character like Robin Hood into it because they're like, yeah, it's fairy tale world. This is, he's going to be here, but it's like he's not a fairy tale. He's folklore. It's not the same, quite the
Yeah.
same thing. So the next question is, who is the intended audience or user of this? I think the obvious one would be children and families. Do you think there was anybody else that they intended? Do you think that they? Because I was born 8 years after this movie came out, and I don't really remember the very first time I saw it. I'm assuming it was on VHS. Do you think that when this movie was made, did they assume that it was going to be held in such high regard by the next few generations?
I think that's a really hard question. I don't know. But I feel like Disney movies traditionally have had a lasting power. They talk about Disney magic that sort of transcends generations. Disney World and Disneyland certainly are marketed. Obviously, kids can't, buy their tickets and drive themselves there, but they're still marketed for families and even adults by themselves. With that, you can go to Disney World without children. That's okay. A lot of people do. So I don't know. I don't know the intention of whoever made this film, but if it was in keeping with that tradition, I would imagine that they hoped that it's something that would appeal to kids, but also the next generation of kids, and maybe as they grow up and maybe their parents and everything.
I think with the simplicity, it definitely, I'm sure they weren't surprised that it stood so long, because it doesn't date itself too much. Some of the music is a little bit
There's
uh,
yeah. There's one line where Little John says that's a gas. And I
yeah,
never understood that as a little kid. And it's because it was outdated slang by the time I saw it.
right. Nobody says that's a gas or anything like that.
That's a gas.
And
I
but for
kind
the
of
most
love
part, it has, they don't really, I mean, because it's taking place, in some bygone era. They don't really nail down exactly the time period. If we are to take them for their word that the lion is actually on crusade, that'd be around 1213, 1214 or so. And also Magna Carta, 1215, would have taken place. I would have loved if somebody had taken the drawing style, because it was King John, Prince John, who was forced to sign Magna
right.
Carta
The Magna
in
Carta.
1215. And I would love it if somebody were to make an illustration of the Disney characters from Robin Hood standing around, or like versions of them, like that drawing style,
That would be amazing.
for making him sign it, which I think probably has something else to do about the time period in which it was made, because whether or not people were fully aware of the extent of Nixon's corruption, one of the things that people were very aware of is just how seemingly unlimited power he had, that he was trying to wield all sorts of strong arm tactics. And what better way to maybe bring some 1215 in there and remind about the origins of limited government. I don't know, maybe that's a stretch, but just going back to the intended audience, I think kids in that era had a lot to choose from, but because it's almost like a serendipity that because they obviously didn't put too much effort into making this, that's what made the movie therefore simple and with so much traction in future years. I mean, it was virtually impossible to find on VHS. Every time I think I would find it, because everybody had it all the time. Every time I would, oh, that's Fox and the Hound. That's not actually, Robin Hood.
Don't make that mistake.
Here's something funny though. I noticed, I was looking the other day at a list of all the Robin Hood in movies and in television, And pretty much from the beginning of movies all the way through, and then the beginning of television, there every decade seems to have several Robin Hood tellings, including the 70s, which, down economy kind of makes sense that people would appreciate, even if they don't expect it to actually happen for them, a character that does the kinds of things, somebody who's on the side of the common person, the ordinary person, and, will find clever ways to get their money back to them. And so it makes sense for this. The 80s didn't really see any Robin Hood at all on either side of,
Oh,
I think.
that's interesting.
And the only Robin Hood that I saw, I think, was an English TV series that was a comedic look at Robin Hood, even before Men in Tights, where they were kind of poking fun at it. So, and then in the 90s, we have, I would argue, is the greatest movie, not just Robin Hood movie, greatest movie ever made, which would be Prince of Thieves.
The number of times I made my poor parents listen to that song in the car.
Everything I do. I loved when that song would come on, and it was just such a weird thing to have a rock and roll ballad to go along with. But the movie was immediately smashed to pieces as soon as Kevin Costner opened his mouth and his lack of English accent shows up. It's like, well, I guess we can't take this movie seriously at all, so we might as well just throw in Bryan Adams, singing this song. And I'm surprised he didn't show up in the middle of but so the 90s had a few Robin Hoods there, both on TV and movies. There was actually one that came out that was a bit more of a serious take on Robin Hood simultaneously with Prince of Thieves. But this that we're discussing, the Disney one, is one of several from the 70s. And then it skips the 80s, back in the 90s, and 2000s, 2010s. I think that economics definitely has a role in it. That when, the 1970s are full of inflation and stagflation and energy crises, and people were really trying to find ways, both parents were working out of the house, or out from the house. They weren't at home working. They were more and more women in the workplace by the 1973, if in many cases just to make ends meet. And having this populist hero of Robin Hood show up in, even if he's in fox, because they could have made him all sorts of animals. They chose a fox, I'm sure, because fox are usually equated with being shrewd and cunning and kind of nimble and always one step ahead of the whoever's trying to out fox them. And in England, they're famous for their fox hunts, so the nobles go out and looking for their foxes. So what better bandit than to have a fox character? I wonder what else they could have done, but I still go back to the ideas and behavior that it conveys, like we were saying before. Had they made the movie earlier, even just 10 years before, I don't think we would have gotten the same feel from it. That kind of rock and roll, kind of, I don't want to say rock and roll, but just like, I don't, it's hard to describe, just kind of like the shaggy, mop toppy kind of feel to it. It's like, the laid back. I love that opening sequence with Robin Hood and Little John walking through the forest, and they get chased by who are like the coolest looking bad guys, by the way. Those.
Oh yeah, they're all like thin and like these dark outlines and like these pointy faces, and
could totally see them in like a video game or something.
Yeah.
But when they're up in the tree, hanging out, and Robin just kind of very casually pulls an arrow from his hat,
right?
And he's like, "They are getting better. I'll hand them that." I just love it. I mean, it's so like it's so like just chilled out, hipster guy, from that era of just mod kind of guy, and he's just and any chance he can get it, take it to the man, he takes it. The next scene is immediately, here comes the prince, here comes the interim king of England, all right, let's go steal from him, just like
Right. Let's dress up as women and go and steal from him by, hiding the coins in our bosoms and
and he's either so dumb or so arrogant or both that he'll just sight unseen be like, yeah, they must be gypsy fortune tellers, how droll. And I'll pull over and I'll deal with these people. And I love it.
I love that about the villains though in this movie, where Disney in a lot of their movies has some really really serious villains. You think about the stepmom in Cinderella and
Mm-hmm.
Maleficent and there's really terrifyingly scary villains. And then
And
you have Robin and Cruella de Vil, right? From
yeah,
right before
or even in Aladdin, it's
Jafar.
Jafar, and he's bad. There's no comic relief for him.
Bad. I love Iago though.
Yeah, he's a very necessary component to that movie.
Absolutely. But
Jafar is so awful.
You have these villains in this movie, the three big ones, plus the vultures, also old-timey Western actors too.
Mm-hmm. With
Trigger and Nutsy. But they're sort of incompetent. They're doing really bad things. Obviously, they're taxing the people like so much. They're taxing the heart and soul out of the people, and
they're going to execute a man of the cloth.
They're going to execute Friar Tuck. Okay, that's bad, right? They're doing these sort of bad things, but I wouldn't. You feel like you wouldn't be afraid to go up and talk to them at a party or something.
Yeah,
they're they don't
or clown on them.
Into my heart, like. I enjoy watching them, as you were talking about earlier, those scenes with Prince John and Sir Hiss. I enjoy those interactions.
But it's almost in a way kind of like Disney's version of Easy Rider, where you have like the law, and there are these Southern sheriff. That's who the sheriff of Nottingham is in this. He's kind of sauntering around, and and then you have Little John and Robin Hood. No merry men, just those two guys. Clowning on everybody, and even when they have a chance to, even when things get serious, and that part with the vulture on top of the gallows is probably one of the most dark, kind of. It's pretty grim look to it, really but
like, he's gonna die. Look, they're gonna hang him.
But even then, like Robin Hood just gets, he goes far beyond just letting go all of the prisoners. He goes and starts messing with, he's like, oh, look all this gold I can get back, and he pushes it. Like that part is probably one of the most suspenseful parts in the movie. Watching him, like he's gonna wake up, like you're the snake.
No, you don't need the one that he's got clutched in his arms. Leave that one behind.
Right.
No, he just get that one. He has to get it.
He takes it all. He wants it all back, and it's. I think that is very just symptomatic of the era. It really just it was like the youth rebellion Disney-fied. They take this guy that because Robin Hood isn't always portrayed that way. He usually not as a fox, but he is as like this just bad boy. He's just that's why Maid Marian likes him. So there's also, I love like I was saying before, the chase scene, which after the tournament devolves into just a execution on the spot, apparently when was it Lady Cluck, right? That's her name.
Lady Cluck.
When she turns into a 20th century American football player.
Yes.
And starts like, and they play the music and everything like that.
Oh my gosh. I tell you, 5-year-old me could have watched that sequence, that like 5-second sequence, like on repeat for the rest of my life. Like
I'm sure you could find a GIF or a GIF somewhere of it, just over and over again, like dun, 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 and just going stiff arming all these rhinos and
That's right.
But the last question that's asked is this prescriptive or descriptive? And it's in a way descriptive because it's taking an
Sure.
old story and adding, just retelling it. It's describing to us, and it starts off very descriptive. It's Alan Adale telling us, here's our version of Robin Hood, and this is a story you might be familiar with. And then they launch into that opening sequence that was eventually turned into the hamster dance, where they
Right, I
walk you
forgot
through.
about the hamster
you
dance.
know I didn't. I remember being on a college campus,
Oh,
my brother's college campus, for it was like moving out day or moving in, one of those, and somebody was blaring from their dorm room window, that in a loop for hours,
yeah.
over and over and over
So
again.
college.
And yeah, it was very
Those early
1997 of them.
days of the internet. Oh my gosh. Kids today don't understand what it was like the early days of the
Just to have, when
hamster
the
dance.
whoever made that discovery and said, hey, this is awesome, we just remember that's from Robin Hood. But it's it's descriptive in its own way of describing the story that we all know. We don't have to go through it all over again. But then it's also prescriptive in the way that we're supposed to take it, and to understand it. And again, I think that just it matches up with the time period very nicely, because movies were in a transitional phase then. It was the era of the big movie companies were passing the torch to younger filmmakers, and the very same people that made up that counterculture, the hippies and the you know just basically the boomer generation. They were in their youth then. They were the young people of that era, and this was their take on Robin Hood, or at least one of them, and prescribing in it to us. And especially after that movie went on to home video, that sense of the 60s are still kind of alive. The
Mhm.
spirit of the 60s didn't necessarily die out as the
Sure.
70s, as we walked into that. So I mean, do you think that am I reading too much into Robin Hood, or are these messages there for you too?
I I think that there are some messages that are just inherent to the story, but as you're saying, there's a reason, either consciously or subconsciously, we're all a product of our time and of the time in which we're living. And that certainly makes sense to me. I would love to hear what the filmmakers have to say about it, or where their heads were when they were creating this schedule
Yeah,
films. But that certainly makes sense to me.
I think that in what I've looked into, and Robin Hood, like I said, had been around in visual media for a long time. It wasn't like
Mhm.
this was the first
Sure.
go at it and they decided to do it. But I think in Disney's quest to hit on all the classics, to master all of the classics, it's actually kind of funny how late it came. That Robin Hood really ought to have been made
Yeah,
probably in the 50s instead
it's true.
of later on. But I don't think that the 50s would have had the same audience for it. I think too many people were, that post-war
Hmm.
golden age. The economy was doing fantastic. Everybody was seemingly, at least, sharing the wealth that the country, the Second World War. And it was the Second World War, but it was the second time that the United States had emerged from a world conflict pretty much untouched, physically, at least, from in the country itself, and our economy was booming. And so a story about stealing from
Right.
the upper
Not a great
classes, and
movie.
doesn't ring as true for a 1950s audience as it might for a
No.
1970s audience, nearly as much. But so yeah, a lot of timelessness here, but also timeliness. And that's why it's always
Yeah.
fun to look at. I think about another Disney movie, actually, just the live action updated version of Beauty and the Beast that came out a few years ago. And there's a great scene in that I always think about when it comes to looking at symbology and symbolism within movies and literature, where Belle is going, she's met a few of the living creatures, the
Mhm.
talking this and talking that, and she picks up a brush from the counter, and she's like, "Oh, what's your name?" And they laugh at her, and she's like, "Not everything here is alive." And so I always have to remind myself of that too, that not everything,
Right.
while everything is a primary source, not everything is a symbol, not everything is
Right.
meant to be taken as, if you break down, which I hope to sometime pretty soon, the Wizard of Oz, either the book The Wonderful Wizard of Oz or the movie,
Mhm.
the most well-known one from 1939, you can find symbols, you can find parallels between real things and the way
Mm.
that is presented in those. But then at the end of the day, you can't match up everything, not every component. The owls with the glowing eyes standing, that's not necessarily meant to be, the some New Deal
The stock
organization that,
market.
it's like, oh, it's the WPA is, that's it's the it's the Who, that's why it's, the owls. um it's not everything is that way. So even though this movie Robin Hood, it has, I think, more than meets the eye, but it also might not be quite as immersed in the time period. But that is also the point of what we do here, and that's to look at these things not necessarily as carriers of symbols, but also just products of their era. So I really
Sure.
appreciate you taking the time. Any last words that you'd like to say about Robin Hood? This
No, I mean,
this is my favorite version of the story.
this is in my top 5 movies of all time. I love this movie. If there's anybody listening to this podcast who hasn't seen Robin Hood, sorry that we spoiled a lot of the moments for you, and
Yeah.
B, go and watch it because it is delightful. Everything about it is delightful, and it's more. We didn't talk about this, but it's more emotional than you think too. There are some really moving moments in this film
Oh
too.
boy, just
Like you're saying, it's more than meets the eye. There's a lot to it.
the part where the kid gets his birthday farthing taken from him, and
Oh
his little
God.
lip starts to quivering, and then the baby sister, I think it is, the way it just says "mama, mama," like, and especially at the
Yeah.
end when it's my baby, and that, oh, that is heartbreaking stuff. And yeah, so even for this supposedly TV-esque, not their greatest effort, still has some lasting power. Definitely still touches plucks the heartstrings.
I'm gonna go watch it right now. I'm gonna put
I
on my
think I
Robin
might too.
shirt and go watch
Well,
it.
I tend to do that with a lot of these afterwards. I'm like, and I should also call this podcast "Everything's a Primary Source," but also ruining people's nice movies, by looking far too into them. And now you can't watch it the same way again. You're like, oh, I think that's supposed to be Richard Nixon there. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and I appreciate all of you listening to this at home. And so join us again next time for the EPS podcast, where everything, including 1973 Disney Robin Hood, is a primary source. We'll see you again.